and welcome to Silly, Sexy, and Sadistic History. I'm Rose, and we're about to get angry at racism again, because this is the part 2 of the Tuskegee Syphilis study episode. So we left off right at the conclusion of the initial study of untreated syphilis in the African American male, in which white doctors acquired volunteers from the rural, poor African American population of Macon, Alabama. However, these volunteers had no idea they were volunteering to be part of an experiment, or even that they had a contagious disease that warranted studying. The initial study was just supposed to last 6 to 8 months, but then the perfectly evilly named Dr. Vandeleur decided he really just wanted to continue this experiment to see how all of these men would die. I will again be quoting Fred Gray quite frequently, and that's that super awesome civil rights attorney that won the eventual lawsuit against the U.S. government for these study participants, because his perspective on these issues is undeniably more valuable than mine. So soon after Dr. Vandeleur sent his letter suggesting the desired continuation of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment to Dr. Clark retired. So Dr. Clark was Dr. Vandeleur's boss, but then Clark retired and Vandeleur got promoted to his position. So he was like, hell yeah, now I can keep experimenting on these black people. In fact, Gray cites Vandeleur writing a letter to another one of the doctors that was part of the study that everyone is in agreement that the proper procedure is to the continuance of observation of the Negro men used in the study with the idea of eventually bringing them to autopsy. So all the doctors were like, yes, let's just watch these men until they die so we can take apart their bodies. Also, the fact that Dr. Vandeleur feels the necessity to classify the men using that N-word that I will repeat in a quotation but not say myself is just so ridiculous. Like, he's again differentiating between these men, like the fact that they're black is somehow going to make their physical response to syphilis different. And so, Dr. Vandeleur and the freaking Surgeon General convinced Alabama state health officials and the local hospitals to continue on with the study, and this time with even out that small requirement of treatment that probably wasn't doing anything anyway, but it was still something. Now there was just nothing. This second phase of the study had 2 major changes. First one was a control group of another 200 men was added, so there was the 400 men that had been participating since the beginning of the study, basically about a year before, that did have latent syphilis, and then they added 200 more that tested negative for syphilis as a control group. The second main change was that intention to follow the study participants to their death for the purpose of autopsy. And in order to fulfill this goal, the study doctors needed the cooperation of everyone in the county that issued death certificates and doctors in hospitals where participants might end up dying at. So, according to Gray, in confidence, Vandeleur told them the purpose of the study and gave them the lists of participants. So initially you had a arguably small group of people doing a really messed up, unethical thing. But now with the addition of including a whole community of coroners and state offices and hospital employees and doctors, all the white guys in the community know what's going on at this point, and they're just totally cool with it. To make sure that these men's families were willing to let the men be autopsied, they basically bribed them with burial insurance, which was a whole $25. And this actually was a pretty big offer just because these people would likely never even have any other type of insurance. And so it was a good incentive for participants and their families to stay in the study for their whole lives. Nurse Rivers herself, so that African-American nurse that was a liaison between the study participants and the doctors themselves, she said, cooperation of patients with this plan was sought by offering burial assistance on the condition that permission be granted for autopsy. So it was just bribery. The doctors also told the men, in order to encourage them to stay in the study and, keep coming back for examinations and stuff, that they wanted to evaluate and continue the bad blood treatment, which they weren't even providing in the first place, and bad blood didn't actually mean anything. So go figure. More lies. Also, this wasn't just something that was happening in small little racist Alabama. All of those samples taken from the autopsies were sent to and studied at the National Health Institute. Like, this was a federal government and federal health system instigated study that had the complete approval of all of those involved, apparently. Nurse Rivers also said that sometimes the family asked questions concerning the autopsy, but offered no objections when they were assured the body would not be harmed. Which, like, what does that even mean, the body would not be harmed? Like, an autopsy is you're cutting someone up and investigating their insides. Like, what's a different type of harm? What's more harmful than that? I don't understand this statement, outside of it just being a lie. And the lies continued. As part of the second phase of this study, yearly blood tests were taken from the participants, and each time they were given an aspirin, although they didn't know what it was, and a green shot, which they also didn't know what was, or what it was for, but it seemed like many of them did assume it was for bad blood. So obviously the aspirin didn't do a whole lot, other than maybe relieve a headache that they might have had, or the constant aches and pains of basic slave labor, and the green shot was just a placebo. Things did get a little complicated when the draft for World War II started, because as part of the draft, people were tested for diseases and expected to get treatment if they had those diseases. So if one of the study participants was drafted and was supposed to get tested and then treated, it became like a whole situation where the study doctors were actually preventing them from getting that treatment. And since that control group of 200 men who did not have syphilis was added, some of them had become infected with syphilis. So in a letter from one study doctor to Dr. Vandeleur, Gray cites, "A new situation has arisen with reference to the untreated syphilis study patients. Some of the control cases who have developed syphilis are getting notices from the draft boards to take treatment. So far, we are keeping known positive patients from getting treatment. Is a control case of any value to the study if he has contracted syphilis? Shall we withhold treatment from a control case who has developed syphilis? Please let me have your wishes with reference to handling this type of patient, and I will carry them out as best I can." So these guys just didn't want there to be any treatment for the men they were studying. Just fuck them so hard. And this same issue arose again a few years later in 1947 when penicillin was discovered as an absolute cure for syphilis. And it was generally known that Macon County had a serious problem with syphilis based on that study referenced at the first episode that had like over a third of the Macon County population testing positive for syphilis. So obviously there was a big push in this area to get that syphilis treated. However, study participants were intentionally excluded. So, alright, fair enough, at the beginning of the study, the treatment was kind of shitty, wasn't really a cure, it took a long time, sometimes had bad side effects, but penicillin was literally just a cure. Like, made them all better. No big deal at all. And they were still like, you know what? No, we just still want these guys to die so we can dissect them. And they were pretty freaking militant about it. So this one guy, Herman Shaw, who is a survivor of the Tuskegee experiment and later became an important figure in fighting for reparations for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment survivors, said that in the late 1940s, they sent me to Birmingham to receive free treatment. I saw a nurse roaming through the crowd. She said that she had been looking for a man that was not supposed to be here, and his name is Herman Shaw. Naturally, I stood up. She said, "Come here." She said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I do not know why they sent me here." They got me on a bus and sent me back home. The implication of this story is that someone involved in the experiment found out one of the guys they were experimenting on was about to receive the cure for syphilis and was like, "Oh shit, can't let that happen. We have to go pull him out of there right now. He needs to keep his syphilis so we can see how it kills him." Like, what the fuck is wrong with these guys? That was just an okay move. This man they've known and been working with for years has the opportunity to end his suffering, and they're like, "Nope, the science is more important than this man's life." That quote and the one that follows are both from Susan Reverby, another academic that I used to research for this podcast, and she very succinctly sums up the consequences of this attitude of such aggressive treatment denial, saying, "With his story, Herman Shaw became almost a 20th century medical runaway slave who tries to escape but gets caught and returned to enslavement to the study." Which in a way, that's really what it was. These men didn't have a choice. Obviously, if Herman Shaw knew what his options were, he would have chosen to save his own life and reduce his chronically uncomfortable suffering as a result of syphilis. But he didn't have a choice, and the doctors actively took away any choice he could have had. Another really disturbing level of this bullshit is the doctors conducting this experiment actually seemed pretty proud of it. They wrote papers and went to conferences, and one doctor, presenting at a venereal disease conference in 1950, described the study's results so far, saying, first, that untreated syphilis apparently shortens the life expectancy by 20%. Second, there is a greater involvement of the cardiovascular system. And third, that syphilitics without treatment appear to be subject to a higher rate of other types of morbidity. Thus, there are more potentially disabling defects among them, and they die earlier. This is probably what most people might expect from general knowledge or assumption, but it's important to have the facts documented. Basically, this freaking guy was admitting the experiments that they were doing on these men weren't actually providing any new valuable insight to science, merely reaffirming what was already known. But he was still proudly defending the value of the experiment anyway. In the 1950s was the first instance of one of the study doctors actually showing a bit of a moral dilemma. He said, "These patients received no treatment on our recommendation. We know now that we have contributed to their ailments and shortened their lives. I think the least we can say is that we have a high moral obligation to those that have died to make this the best study possible." So yeah, he admitted what they did was fucked up and they contributed to the premature death of these men. However, he just used that as an excuse to keep the study going. Like, well, we've already killed some people, and more are probably going to die because of us. But it only makes sense that we keep going, because then they would have died for nothing if we don't get the best science possible out of their lives. It's just so very obvious that these guys did not give a fuck about the men they were experimenting on. They only cared about what could be learned from them. They weren't human, they were test subjects in their eyes. Saying, "I think the least we can say is that we have a high moral obligation to those that have died to make this the best study possible," is basically saying, to honor these men unknowing sacrifice, let's not repay them at all, but instead keep taking more from them. Racist logic. Now these study doctors were obviously still terrible and racist, and not really changing anything about what they were doing or how they were doing it. But the world around them was changing. The late 1950s, things started moving toward the civil rights movement and fighting for racial equality. For instance, the 1955 Brown versus the Board of Education was the decision that separate education facilities were inherently unequal. Though thinking back to that episode 1 statistic of white students' education costing 10 times as much as black students' education, how that's pretty freaking obviously very unequal. And it took until 1955 for the government to admit that, but they did, and segregation had begun to fall. For the next decade, things kind of went on business as usual for the study. Men died, doctors dissected their corpses, learned stuff that they probably already knew. You know. Gray marks the beginning of the third and final phase of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, as being in 1965. He distinguishes this date as the beginning of the end. 400 to 500 of the original 600 participants had died. There was a whole new generation of staff, and race relations had evolved a lot. Unfortunately, the civil rights movement didn't actually seem to make the doctors involved more concerned with the morality of the study they were conducting. It just made them worry more about how it would make them and the government look. And so they had meetings about what excuses to give when people asked them questions about the racial issue. They decided that the people were at the point that the therapy would no longer help them anyway. So why bother trying to cure them or give them any treatment or tell them that they've ruined them and their families' lives? Might as well see it out to the end so you can get those all-important autopsy results in. And somehow, this very flimsy excuse was supposed to stand up against the new international guidelines on human experimentation following all the crazy fucked up shit done in Nazi concentration camps by those mad scientists. And although the Tuskegee Study very obviously violated many of these international guidelines, it was still just able to continue for decades after those guidelines had been put into effect. Finally, within this final phase, the study did start to face some external criticism. In response to one publication written about the study, an uninvolved doctor said she was utterly astounded by the fact that physicians allow patients with a potentially fatal disease to remain untreated when effective treatment is available. I'm like, no shit. That is utterly astounding. How is this the first person to say that? But I mean, finally we got someone saying it, and I don't know if you noticed that, but it was a lady doctor, so right on. In 1965, the doctors now conducting the study held a meeting about its future. One said, "Should we terminate the study or should we continue it? It becomes a political problem. At the time the study was begun, there was no concern about the racial problem, discrimination, etc. At that time, there was no problem about not treating the disease." Alright, I just had to take a little scream break because it would have been very mean of me to just have a scream all of a sudden in your ears. But imagine that I screamed about that, just really loud, just scream. Because at the time there was no problem about not treating the disease. Yes, there was. There was a huge problem. The problem was that it was terrible as shit, you freaking jackhole. Alright, sorry, I yelled a little bit. This guy specifically says, it's not a moral, ethical problem. It's just a political one. These guys still didn't give a shit about the lives of the men they were playing with. However, offering treatment was at now least a discussion being had, but in the end of this 1965 meeting, the doctors decided that under state law, the informed consent of people is required if they are subject to investigation, medical tests, etc. However, the educational level of the Negroes in the study is so low that it would not be possible to explain informed consent. I'm going to refer back to part 1 here again. If you remember, we talked about why this group of people were chosen for the Tuskegee Syphilis study, and it is because they had very little social power and very little understanding of what is to be expected from a doctor, because they were too poor to even have really been helped by doctors before, other than those just kindly providing philanthropic funded treatment. In other words, these men's lack of agency and social standing in such a deeply racist society made them the perfect victims to be taken advantage of in the 1930s and in the 1960s. So little had changed, despite the efforts of the burgeoning civil rights movement. These meetings and documents discussing the value of continuing the study also seem to always emphasize that there would never be again an opportunity like this, and using that and other excuses to keep the experiment going as long as possible. So the recognition that society as a whole has agreed what we're doing is wrong, so we won't be able to do it again, so we should keep doing it as long as possible? What? Another excuse they used was there probably would have been resistance to treatment on the part of poorly educated rural Negro males in Alabama anyway, so why bother treating them? And this is just obviously bullshit, because since the 1940s, thousands of men in the same demographic were bussed up to Birmingham and treated by the US government for syphilis. That was exactly the target market for all that free STD treatment, and that they did treat thousands of people, so it's just ludicrous to think that these men would be resistant to being treated. Also, they'd been getting placebo shots every year for their whole lives that they were thinking was treatment, so why would they be resistant to legitimate treatment? Finally, in this 1960s period, they did end up approving some treatment in some cases, but it was pretty much just treatment for that original control group, of which quite a few had subsequently become infected with syphilis because of the huge prevalence of syphilis in Macon County. So those guys that really didn't have a reason not to be treated anyway because they were the controls, they finally got the opportunity to get treatment 40 years later. The Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the African American male finally ended in 1972 when someone with the Public Health Service finally grew a conscience. There's this guy named Buxton, and he went to the press with the first article that was published about this in 1972, because he recognized that it was a horribly immoral thing to do. And the next day, so he got the first one published, the next day it was on the front cover of the New York Times, and the public was understandably pissed and there was pretty much immediately some congressional hearings held, and the CDC and Public Health Service appointed a panel to review the study, and they made the very obvious conclusion that this study was really, really messed up and should be ended immediately. Following the public outcry, the NAACP filed a lawsuit on behalf of the survivors and their families, and this is where the super awesome Fred Gray comes in to be the legal champion for the men victimized by this government manipulation, deceit, and unethical experimentation, because he was that NAACP lawyer that won that for them. As a consequence of the lawsuit, the government had to give $10 million, which is like $51.8 million in 2020 money, to the survivors and their descendants, and also provide free medical treatment to survivors and the family members they had infected as a consequence of no one even telling them they had a contagious disease. So finally, the government was doing the right thing and treating these people and their descendants. It just took over 40 years and an extremely public lawsuit. Congress also did create a commission meant to draft new regulations so the shit wouldn't happen again, which is nice, but the regulations in place already wouldn't have been allowing this, but I guess at least they're trying. However, the government still would only admit that the participants in the study were African American, it began in 1932, and that it was conducted by the government. So they still wouldn't admit any wrong or racism or unethical scientific practices. And this was all the way in the 70s when the civil rights movement had a lot of power, and racism was something that people were very aware of, but the government was still like, meh, we didn't do anything wrong. I mean, we lost the lawsuit, but we're not going to admit any fault. Finally, in 1997, 65 years after the beginning of the Tuskegee Syphilis study, President Clinton did hold a ceremonial, big formal apology to the study survivors and their families. And this is probably too little too late, but Clinton actually did have a really nice apology, and reading it really reminded me of the dream fantasy of having a president that can string multiple words together to make a whole complete sentence. Anyway, here's some of that apology. The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful. And I am sorry. I am sorry that your federal government orchestrated a study so clearly racist. We cannot be one America when a whole segment of our people has no trust in America. No ground is gained, and indeed much is lost if we lost our moral bearings in the name of progress. And say what you want about Clinton, but that's a good apology. That's owing up to the racism and the immorality. Clinton acknowledged the shame that we should all feel that this was allowed to happen in the U.S., and we should all feel shame because it should not happen. I wish it was more surprising that it had happened, but the American governmental institution has been racist since its foundation. Doesn't mean it can't change, doesn't mean we can't be better. And it's so fucking ridiculous that the study participants had to wait 65 years after most of them had already died to hear an apology for the just excruciating pain they went through on behalf of the progress of the U.S. But they finally got one, and it was at least not a bad one. Clinton goes on to even mention they had the power to heal the survivors, and all the others, and they did not. Today, all we can do is apologize, but you have the power, for only you, meaning the study survivors and their families, have the power to forgive. And I appreciate that these final thoughts from Clinton's apology provide some power and agency to the men of the Tuskegee Study, because that's truly what was the most lacking. They had no social power, they had no agency to make decisions for themselves. And again, this is certainly too little too late, but Clinton's rhetorical attempt to try to give some power and agency back to these men is still a beautiful thing. So was there any legitimate policy change as a consequence of the horrors of the Tuskegee Study coming to light? Well, like I said, it was already well outside of what was okay by national and international standards. But according to Gray, the consequential policy change reaffirmed the principle that prior informed consent should be obtained from individuals before they are allowed to participate in human experimentation. As a result of this, and the enactment of laws after some of the participants testified before a Senate committee, the government has reevaluated the use of human beings in experiments and has set minimum standards in order to conduct human experimentations. That's not me dying Gray. That's me dying the concepts he's talking about. Yes, these are things that should have already been true. People should not have had to have died at the hands of the government to end up with these conclusions. There was a couple other pretty cool things to come out of Clinton's apology. He made a promise to start the Tuskegee Human Rights and Multicultural Center, and by he starting it, I meant the federal government said that they would pay for it. And this was a direct result of Herman Shaw, so if we remember that guy talking about how he went to Birmingham, Alabama to get treatment for syphilis and then they turned him away because he was a study participant. So it's that guy. He's still alive in 1992 when Clinton's apologizing, and what he wants is for a center to be built as part of the government reparations, hoping to educate people so this would not happen again and to celebrate the diversity of his home and the struggles that came out of that diversity. Which is really great. He wasn't just like, yeah, take care of me and take care of my family. He wanted something built for his community so that they could learn and grow together. Fred Gray was also a huge proponent of this multicultural center being built because, according to Gray, Macon County typifies, in many ways, the history of American diversity. It was populated first by Native Americans. Then Europeans came, some bringing African American slaves. Eventually the Native Americans were driven from their homes. Afterwards, thousands more whites came, and even more African American slaves. Then a war was fought over slavery, and the African Americans gained their physical, if not their economic and civic freedom. Then another war was fought, this one with the weapons of law and nonviolent protest, so that African Americans could have political freedom. And all of these things very much happened in Macon County, making it a perfect place to have a center museum situation to really educate and exemplify that history of America. This area was also a really perfect place to celebrate diversity because there was also other really big Black contributions in this area. So there's Booker T. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute and created that center of Black excellence in education and research. And there's also George Washington Carver from this area. That's the guy that come up with all the things to do with peanuts and growing sweet potatoes, and he was a huge advocate for poor farmers, sharecroppers, to be growing their own food so they weren't beholden to their landlords for sustenance. Also, the Tuskegee Airmen from World War II, so that was one of the first groups of African American men to really be celebrated as war heroes. And that center was built, and it exists in Tuskegee, Alabama, and I'm going to put a link to the website in the show notes. And another super cool part of Clinton's apology was the government agreed to fund a bioethics center at Tuskegee Institute. So that's pretty good. The evolution there is pretty impressive to the Tuskegee Institute hosting these racist experiments, to it having $4.1 million of federal money for researching how to conduct experimentation ethically. And there's also a link to that website in the show notes. And these things are all well and good, and everyone wishes you could have a happy ending to a story, but I just can't end on a happy ending, because racism is still real, and things are still fucked. One of the things Gray writes is, many organizations are doing many things. In the names of the participants in the Tuskegee Syphilis study, many proposals have been written, and some funded in the name of or as a direct result of the persons in the Tuskegee Syphilis study. Yet, in virtually none of these instances have the participants themselves been contacted or given the opportunity to be involved. So again, these men and their stories and their lives are just being used without their knowledge or consent. And maybe it's to hopefully do good things this time, but still, isn't it pretty obvious that the whole problem here is that these guys weren't given a choice and still are just not given a choice? It's... the paternalism is just insane. Also, in part 1, I promised you a rant about the CDC. And during the course of my research, just Googling Tuskegee Syphilis Study, one of the first Google search results you get if you Google the Tuskegee Syphilis Study is the CDC's website. And on the FAQ, which was last reviewed according to that website on March 2nd, 2020, there is a question: when did the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee become unethical? And the answer is, the study became unethical in the 1940s when penicillin became the recommended drug for treatment of syphilis and researchers did not offer to the subjects. And, ideally, I've done a good enough job explaining the fundamentally problematic nature of the study that I don't need to explain why that answer to that question is just fills me with murder rage. But obviously, in the 1940s, when penicillin was discovered as a cure for syphilis, it was super messed up that the doctors did not give the study participants penicillin to cure their syphilis. But from the beginning of the Tuskegee Study, there was treatment for syphilis. These men weren't told they were being experimented on. They weren't told they had a disease that could be killing their children and wives and permanently maiming them. But no, it wasn't unethical until the 1940s. And so I've written a scathing email to the CDC so they fix their shit. And I hope you do the same. There is also a link to that website in the show notes. You can go look at it and be angry with me. So yeah, in conclusion, fuck the CDC. I hope this episode and the previous one did a sufficient job explaining this horrid situation, why it happened, and its consequences in a historical context, and why it should still be cared about today. If you enjoyed this, please leave a comment, give me a like, or subscribe. Be super awesome. And like always, if I've said anything wrong, or it seems like my facts are off, or if I've said something that just wasn't quite the right things to say, just tell me so I can improve. I want to do the best job possible, and I want this to be inclusive and welcoming content, despite my cuss words and my anger. But it's justified, right? I think I'm justified to be really pissed off about this one. Anyway, thanks for listening to me sit here and talk about history. It's my favorite thing to do. Stay angry about, fighting against, and making progress towards ending racism.